Now, love or hate the Star Wars sequel trilogy that we got, one thing and I think most fans would absolutely love to know is, what would George Lucas have done with the sequels? What would his episodes 7, 8, and 9 have looked like or been about? And though we have gotten some small details here and there before about how it would have gone into the microbiotic realm and dealt with things like the wills, and I'll recap some of that a bit later in the video, we've recently learned several more rather interesting details thanks to a new book called The Star Wars Archives 1999 to 2005, which kind of obviously mainly deal with the prequels, but also get a bit into George Lucas's sequels, as well as the reason why Lucas never made them himself, which I'll also talk about in this video. Anyway, according to Lucas in this book, the main villain of his sequel trilogy would have been Darth Maul, and his apprentice would have been Darth Talon. He's even quoted as saying that Maul eventually becomes the godfather of crime in the universe because, as the Empire falls, he takes over. He also said Darth Maul trained a girl, Darth Talon, who was in the comic books as his apprentice. She was the new Darth Vader, and most of the action was with her, so these were the two main villains of the trilogy. And it should be quickly noted that no, this wouldn't mean bringing back Darth Maul from the dead yet again, or a second time after his death in Rebels, because had Lucas never sold to Disney, Rebels never happens and Maul never dies that way. Though honestly, that was easily one of the best episodes of that show, and I thought a great way for Maul's story to end, but according to this, it wouldn't have ended anything like that, and his return in Clone Wars and the forming of the Shadow Collective would have really been just the beginning for this character. And honestly, it's very interesting yet curious to hear just how much George Lucas has apparently gotten on board the Darth Maul hype train over the years, if you will. I mean, let's be honest here, Maul's not much of a character in The Phantom Menace. It didn't seem like there was much of a plan beyond that movie, especially considering he dies. Yes, he looks absolutely amazing, and he's involved in arguably the most epic-looking lightsaber battle in the history of the franchise, but again, he dies or seems to die before he actually really does anything or anything about him for future use gets set up. And though you might counter that by saying, well, Lucas brought him back in the Clone Wars, so he never meant for that to be the end of the character, despite how it looked. But the truth of the matter is, as far as I've ever heard, George Lucas didn't really have a plan for bringing Maul back in that series, that he was the one that, yes, wanted to do it and gave the green light, but that he went to Dave Filoni and said, make this happen, that Lucas himself didn't really have an idea for how to do it, which would then seem to imply, since he was going to make him the villain of the sequels, that he really liked what Filoni and company had come up with so much that it shaped his vision for the future of the whole or overall story of Star Wars. Furthermore, it's also interesting to learn that Lucas would have embraced and used Darth Talon, a character that came about in the expanded universe, which, is certainly something he's done before, with Aya Sakura being one such example of a character that he saw in a comic book, liked, and then put in the movies. But other than getting some exploration in the Clone Wars, she was essentially a background character, whereas in the case of Darth Talon, it sounds like she would have actually been pretty much the main antagonist. But anyway, moving on a bit, these weren't the only details we learned, and apparently, again quoting Lucas here, the movies are about how Leia, who else is going to be the leader, is trying to rebuild the Republic. Luke is trying to restart the Jedi. He also said that this process would be harder than starting a rebellion or fighting a war, and that speaking of Leia, she ended up being the chosen one. Which is certainly an intriguing statement, since George Lucas has clearly said before that Anakin is or was the chosen one. Not to mention, with Darth Maul still around at the end of Return of the Jedi, that would mean the Sith kinda weren't destroyed as the prophecy said they would be. Even though I guess you could argue that technically Maul isn't a Sith, but even without calling himself that, for all intents and purposes, he still pretty much was, I think. Either way here, I'm honestly a little surprised to see that Lucas would use the Sith as the villains of the sequel trilogy. I assume there might be some type of new, different threat as the Republic and Jedi tried to rebuild, but I guess not. However, I do think the Skywalker family itself would have sort of become the chosen one, or ones, because we do know the next generation of Skywalkers would have also played a big part in the sequels, and I think, unlike the Disney sequel trilogy, Anakin's Force Ghost would have played a part as well. And speaking of the Chosen One and things people might not be so fond of or find a little controversial, it seems we would have learned in Lucas's sequel that it was the Wills that commanded the midichlorians to create Anakin, even though originally Lucas's idea seemed to be that Palpatine had created Anakin, or commanded the midichlorians to create him, which was even going to be revealed in Revenge of the Sith. And so when we look at all these things sort of together, that Maul would have been a crime boss that tried to take over the galaxy, that Darth Talon would have been brought in as his apprentice, and that the Whills, and not Palpatine, had created Anakin, it says to me that there has been a lot of changes over the many years in regards to what Lucas would have done with the sequels. Because in days gone by, we've heard different things or different ideas in regards to them, and one of the reasons why I bring this up is because, for whatever reason, so many like to believe that Lucas, from the very beginning, has always had this sort of one set story in his head for the whole thing, and that nothing ever changes with it, that there was this eureka moment 40-some years ago where he realized the whole story all at once. And though in a way that sounds awesome, that everything Star Wars jumped into being or existence all at once in the mind of George Lucas, that's just not the reality of it. And the main reason I bring this up is because there are always those who will point to something Lucas said sometimes years ago as absolute proof or evidence of something today. But the truth is, Lucas has said many different things and contradicted himself many times over the years. And I'm not criticizing him for that at all. I'm just reminding everyone he's human, and he can either change his mind and or not have it all figured out always. So anyway, I think the things that he's saying now, or that are coming out now, are indeed what his final idea for the sequels were and what we would have got. And they seem to be heavily influenced by other outside factors, which I don't think is a good or bad thing per se, it's just something worth noting. Also, in the sequel trilogy, we would have learned a lot more about the Whills, like how they are, in a sense, the Force, but then Lucas kind of contradicts himself by also saying they feed off the Force. He also said, and again these are his words, that the Whills sort of ride around in people like vehicles, and these are actually all things he originally wanted to get more into detail with in the prequels, but the negative reaction to the midichlorians in The Phantom Menace sort of stayed his hand. Also in this book, Lucas clears up why he didn't make the sequels himself, and ultimately why he sold to Disney, and despite what so many want to claim or believe, it wasn't because of negative reaction to the prequels. In this book, Lucas even says that he knew fan reaction to the prequels, and The Phantom Menace in particular, might be a bit mixed, but that he'd rather tell an original story than the same one all over again. Not sure if that was meant to be a dig at Disney, but it certainly could be. Anyway, in this book, Lucas said about making the sequels that, at that time I was starting the next trilogy, I talked to the actors and I was starting to gear up. I was also about to have a daughter. It takes 10 years to make a trilogy. I'd still be working on episode 9. Finally, I decided I'd rather raise my daughter and enjoy my life for a while. And this is all something I've tried to point out to people many times before who want to just believe that he sold because of hatred of the prequels, and it's great to finally hear or read Lucas say it. When he sold Lucasfilm, he was in his late 60s, he had just gotten remarried, and he had a baby on the way. And as he said, it takes 10 years to make a trilogy. He'd still be doing it right now. And when it came right down to it, he picked family over making another trilogy, which actually sounds like a very Star Wars-like decision to make, and one I cannot blame him for. Nevertheless, I would have loved to have gotten Lucas's sequel over the one we got, even though, yes, there are some things about it that sound a bit odd or curious, but as he kind of said about the prequels, at least they would have been original, at least they would have world-built and furthered the overall story of Star Wars. Unlike the sequels that we got, which basically told the same story all over again and ended with one lone Jedi ready to rebuild the Jedi Order, and apparently another New Republic ready to try all over again, which is exactly how the original trilogy ended. And as Lucas said in this book, restarting those things would have been harder than starting a war or fighting a rebellion, yet we never get to see that struggle. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about all this. Do you love or hate the idea of Darth Maul being the villain of the sequels and that Darth Talon would have been his apprentice? And what do you think about delving more into the microbiotic realm and learning more about things like midichlorians and the Whills? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.